How's it going, YouTube? Coming up today with another video, and today, guys, what to bring to you is the meta tier list for April 2022. I am joined by Koty Angeloff. Go ahead and say hello and introduce yourself for those of you who may not know you.
Hey guys, my name's Cody, and I am a quote-unquote professional player, coach, all that stuff.
And the current reigning national champion.
Ah, yes. Who can forget that, right?
The
Oh,
longest.
also I'm part of luxury gaming as well.
Yeah, isn't that crazy? Like, just how that worked out, too. So, like, technically, you're the longest reigning national champion.
Technically, yeah. Is this actually a Nats as well?
Uh,
Do you
it,
think this is actually a Nats since anyone can join or what?
I think it's a glorified YCS with the way that they described it.
Yeah, that's how I'm feeling as well.
I'm still gonna go, though, Like, it's still gonna be a great time.
Oh yeah, 100%.
So I'm excited for it, but there is a meta tier list that I felt was needed. Whether or not we get a ban list before or after the YCS coming up, I definitely think it's going to be a bit after, but we wanted to make sure that we can go down and kind of describe to you how the meta is looking right now and where we're heading toward the better decks at. So to start things off today, we have Emancipator Rocks. Where are you putting this one, Cody?
Emancipator. Okay, so just from looking at this, a lot of like the lower tier decks are going to be before, but from what we were talking about earlier is like you want to include a lot of these decks simply because like people do like these decks, and also they do have some type of viability within the meta as well. Um, at Emancipator, I don't know, it's weird. Like since I feel like Nib is shifting out of the format now because of the branded Despia decks and variants coming out. I feel like this deck is like it still does the same things that it's always done. It makes big boards. It can do a whole bunch of different routes, like with Scythe Lock, since it can make DPE with like Baron and stuff. The only thing is like the deck can't really go second. Still, it's the same problem ever since Black Dragon got banned. I think you would agree with me on that, that it can't really go second anymore.
Yeah, the deck itself definitely has a lot of issues currently. I do know that they're getting some new support soon, which is pretty nice. But as the deck stands right now, I think that as a solid rogue option, it's really nice. Again, the deck in the format right now, with the way the hand traps are looking, like you were saying, it definitely has a lot more viability, but it's still not really up there compared to the other decks that we're really seeing right now. So I would still throw this into the rogue category where it stands.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. Like the tier 2 decks are the ones that you actually do see play as well. And I can't tell you the last time I saw an Adam Emancipator player. I'm not gonna lie. Even though I know there are a lot of like hardcore like stands behind the deck.
Yeah, and there's a lot of decks out there like that, right? That they'll see their times in and out of the game, whether or not people are still playing it. But as of right now, it'd still be in the rogue category.
Yeah, I agree with that.
The next one up is going to be Sun Avalon. We actually talked a little bit about this as well, and it's just one of those decks that's really nice, and especially, again, just to kind of go back to the fact that Nibiru is being shifted out of the format, this is another deck that I could see with the Brave Engine doing pretty okay. We did see it at the PPG, but again, I would still throw this in Rogue as well, just because just on the sheer amount of players not really on this deck and the ability to not really be able to go second that well with it either, I would say this falls into the same category as the Adam Inspirator Rock deck.
Right, and I'd have to agree with you again with that because also another thing is like not many people play it, which also means that a lot of people don't know how to play against it as well. So if a lot more people like were to pick up the Sun Avalon deck and start learning it, probably for about a week or two, like the deck would probably be around tier 2 to tier 1.5. But the only thing is like no one's really playing the deck. And if you do play against a Sun Avalon deck, then it's very easy to stop, like as soon as you play against it once as well. But it does do crazy things. Like if it does go in uninterrupted, you pretty much win the game immediately. But yeah, it's definitely a rogue choice at the moment.
Yeah, it's very true. I like the deck a lot. I think that it has a lot of potential, but as of right now, I think that if you look on the game in a very grand scale of things, there's just other decks that just really outshine this one in particular. So I definitely would feel like it would be underneath those for sure. But there's a couple decks out there that, even though they're not the best choice, there's still really solid choices out there. Which, like DDD for me, I would definitely would say it would be like that tier two. There's enough people still playing the deck, and it still has a lot of application, and I think that the deck's still really cool. Definitely, again, being outshined by a lot of other decks right now, but I still think that it's really nice.
Right. And the one thing like that about DDD is like a lot of people know how to play against it now. And the biggest thing is like, so before I would have put it at like a tier 1 or tier 1.5. But now, ever since like the branded Despia became a deck, DDD struggles really hard with that deck because even though you can still make High King Caesar to negate like the branded fusions, you can negate branded opening, you negate poly, you negate all these cards. Uh, that deck cannot like it just dies to super poly. Like just it's as easy as that. Like it just dies to super poly very, very easily. That and it doesn't really have a good way to play around droplets either.
I feel like this deck is also one of those things where it's like Sun Avalon, where a lot of people lost to this deck because they didn't really know how to play around it or how to play against it. And now that there's so many hand traps in the format, especially, it just becomes a really hard time for DDD to be able to perform.
Exactly. And another one of like its big strengths that it had was that it could play through Nib very, very well. And now that Nib's like shifting out of the format for more of these like board breaking type cards, or shifting out of the meta for more cards like Valor and Imperm in the main deck instead of Nib, I feel like that with those cards coming back into the meta as well, DDD gets a lot weaker.
Yeah, I'm sure it'll find its way back up, but for now, it's definitely just tier 2.
Yeah, I agree.
Not a terrible pick if you want to go to a regional or something, but I definitely feel like you'd have to A, play the deck perfectly, and then B, again, just really hope that you're not going to get super polyed on your end board.
Exactly.
It's a tough one, but tier 2. The next one, I think this is always an interesting one every time that we talk about it. Virtual World is one of those decks that it was really good back in like the VFD format, and then we saw it on a bit of a decline, and I don't really feel like it ever really got back up, even with the Brave cards. And I think this just falls strictly under Rogue at this point. I'd see DDD being played way more than Virtual World. And I know that there's a lot of really cool options for the deck, and you can Scythe Lock, and you can do some nice plays, but I feel like it's just not prevalent enough for me to put it any higher.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with the thing is with Virtual World is that it just doesn't have good inboards anymore. Like Shinshin doesn't really do anything against like the
Despia.
branded Despia decks. It doesn't really do much against Sword Soul either. And it's not that great against Eldritch as well. So like with those three decks being like really high up right now in the format, like being probably like the decks to look out for or the most represented decks. Like with that being a thing, Virtual World doesn't really have much else going for it unless it does Scythe Lock. And if you're just trying to Scythe Lock people, I feel like you would just want to play something else like Phantom Knight or like Pile Deck or like Cyber's Eldritch or even like perhaps like potentially like Prank Kids even. I feel like Prank Kids can just Scythe Lock better than Virtual can. So yeah, I would definitely have to put this into Rogue, especially as well that it takes like 3 cards to be able to play.
Yeah, and again, one of those things where we're already playing so many hand traps, I just feel like that deck has a really tough time when that's in the format.
I agree. Yeah.
So the next one, I feel like we might differ a little here, for sure. Plunder Patrol is one of those really interesting decks as well, where we saw it not really being that big of a threat in the TCG, and then it started becoming one of those decks where if you go to a tournament, you don't exactly expect that you're going to play against one, but you have in your mind that you could. Even at the PPG, we saw 2 of them top. And the deck itself, I feel like it can play so much utility, and a lot of people still don't really know how to play against the deck. That for me, I'd put it in tier two. I feel like this is something where if it's a really smart pilot and they've been playing the deck for a little while, they can really go into an event and do well.
So, funny enough, I think Plunder Patrol is in a great spot right now because the only decks that are like making like unbreakable type boards right now are going to be like Prank Kids, right? Even though like the Despia variants are going to be making like big boards, they're not going to be making unbreakable boards. You can also argue that Tortoise is making like unbreakable boards since Nib's not as prevalent in the format anymore. So with that being said, like I feel like Plunder Patrol, like it's probably in the best spot that it's ever been in
Yeah,
right now.
it's a
Like
really cool
with
deck.
all the Brave cards, like with all the Brave cards as well. And like if you think about it, Plunder Patrol was the original Fallen of Albaz. Like the whole archetype just uses their opponent's monsters to their advantage. And like the thing is, as well, is like if you ever get into a grind game with Plunder Patrol, you're going to lose. It's probably the best deck like on the list that we have today that like for grinding because the whole deck just grinds like infinite.
Would you also put that in tier two?
Uh, I would probably say tier two. I was thinking potentially 1.5 as well, but I think tier two is definitely reasonable.
I think the only reason I'm putting it more so in tier two, like I said, is like the pilot that's behind it, right? Is because we've seen the deck do pretty well, and we've also seen it enter tournaments and just get washed. So it's one of those things where the deck itself, it does take a little bit of planning on your own end, especially with your main deck techs and like what kind of hand traps, and how you're choosing to play around the format. Because even in the Prank Kid matchup, I feel like you have a nice time, again, as long as you go first, because you have cards like Moark that can like banish the Prank Kid and whatnot, on top of all your hand traps you're already playing. So I like the deck a lot. I actually played it for a little while too. And I definitely think that, like you were saying, out of the better grind decks, this is definitely one of them.
Yeah, I would definitely have to agree with that. So I think tier two is fine. It could potentially be 1.5 though.
I would agree with that. It can get moved up for sure. I'm definitely excited to see whenever we get these Earth and Wind ships.
Yeah, that's also true.
Because if Flow on Rees ends up getting a bit of lesser play because of the Despia deck being able to send Banshee, I feel like that's even better because like that's a horrible matchup for Plunder. The fact that you can't like summon a ship, so like even more so pushing it up like more toward 1.5. The next one though, this one's actually just really funny because I actually see this at least once a tournament. Someone's playing this, and this is Altergeist. This is a deck that I would firmly put in Rogue. I think that it's honestly the worst trap deck that we have right now. It definitely has a lot of cool pieces for it, but I just don't think that it goes anywhere past Rogue.
Yeah, I agree with you 100% on that. You pretty much summed it up.
Yeah.
Like you pretty much summed the entire archetype up in pretty much what you just said.
Yeah, it's like quite literally the worst trap deck we have right now. Which I mean, the Eldritch deck too. It's so versatile, and we'll get to that when we talk about it. But there's so many different ways you can play the deck that I just would rather be on something like that than Geist, where it just feels like you just lose, especially if you have to go second.
Yeah, 100%.
So with Drytron though, we've been seeing this deck just really kind of pop in and out of the format, especially at that first YCS. We saw it really have a good number of representation in the top cut. This is a deck that I think really does go a long way in our format, and especially if you really know how to be smart with building this, and which variant you take on it, I feel like it definitely has a lot of potential to play really well in the format. A lot of people would probably put this in like 1.5. I would put it in tier 2 just because I feel like it has the same playability as like D. I know that it has a little bit more, but to me, I just don't really see it being over tier 2 because again, there's just a lot better choices right now.
Right. Funny enough, I was going to put Drytron in Rogue.
You can put it in Rogue. I just have seen it in too many top cuts lately.
The only reason why I was going to put it in Rogue is because this deck cannot play around Nib. That's the only reason. This deck just cannot play around it like
I'm
reliably.
Yeah, the reason I also put it up there though is because like that card's also like out of the format, like quote unquote, right now. So
Mhm.
it becomes a bit better, and it's also just using the branded cards now as well. And I've seen it in a lot of top cuts, so I would just probably put it in two because I just feel like I have to respect that deck if I'm gonna see it in a tournament.
Right. Even though like Drytron is pretty much just turned into another like scythe deck, it definitely still makes very turn one board, like very strong turn one boards. But the fact that like the most oppressive part about Drytron is being cut from the deck now, uh, I can allow, like I could see it being tier two, or rogue at this point.
So whenever I look at a tier list like this too, I'm always looking at like the line above has to be a deck I would respect more than the deck below it.
Mhm.
So if I looked at Drytron, or if you told me to play a deck right now that was Drytron or any of the four in the Rogue, I would definitely pick Drytron all day. So for me, I would just have to put it above them.
Yeah, that's fair.
Um, what's interesting though is so we've seen so many different decks coming out of like seeing based or seeing like the sad deck. But then we had three access, and three access is a deck that it's done okay in the game so far. And it's probably, in my opinion, out of all the newer decks that have come out with like all the different engines and whatnot, this would, in my opinion, be the worst one. What do you think about three access?
Um, so there's like a lot of different things that three axis does that like regular like base does and like what stat does, right?
Right.
But the thing is that the three axis deck, I I don't know, it just feels a little too clunky for me
I would have
because
to agree.
like it just feels a little clunky because your starters are going to be like Sangan, it's going to be like I think that's really the only like one card unless I'm just completely missing something. But like the deck's just full of extenders as well, which is
Yeah,
like very important to note.
because they're just trying to get to Cherubini.
Yeah, exactly. They're just trying to get the cherubim. Also, another thing is I don't think a lot of people know how to like play against the three axis deck. Like people don't understand that you just stop them from getting to Cherubini and you win.
Yeah, that or you you Ash the Hulk. You can't Ghost Ogre the Hulk in this deck though because they don't go for like the Auroradon combo. The whole point of this deck is for them to summon Red Rose from the deck. So either you stop them from getting Cherubini or you Ash Imperm the Hulk, and then it's kind of just GG from there.
Right.
So for me, I mean, like the deck again is being more represented than the other ones in Rogue, but and like it's also just playing like similar engines too. So I don't know if I could put it in Rogue, but it feels like it should be in Rogue.
Honestly, the thing is like I feel like it would be tier 1.5 or 2 because I don't think any of the other like base type like decks are going to be under tier 1.5.
Yeah, that's why I'm having a hard time trying to place this one right now because like it's not like super bad. It's not like super good. I could agree with like a tier two, but I couldn't do like 1.5 in my own head.
That's fine. For me, I would personally put it at 1.5 because it's pretty much just another chroma of like all the other pile decks right now.
That's fair. I just like I look at that deck as a means of like, okay, your whole point is get to like Cherubini. And then I look at the other decks right now where I'm like, okay, DDD's whole point is like get to Gilgamesh or like get to Bluebeard or not Bluebeard, the Link 2. And it's one of those things where if there's just like a sole purpose to get into one monster and if that cutoff gets like cut off, then they just lose. I just kind of have to wrap it up with the same decks.
The only reason why I would put it at 1.5 is because the deck plays a lot more extenders than all the other decks that
Yeah.
are in the tier 2 right now.
It also plays a lot of hand traps.
Yeah, like I remember the last time I saw this deck, was one of my friends, Koty Manabe, playing it. And he was playing like 28 hand traps in the main deck.
Oh, he waxed me 2-0 in the PPG. I'm not even gonna lie about that. He definitely got me in that event. There was a lot of hand traps. But ever since like that event, I just haven't seen the deck do anything. That's where I'm kind of getting like my lower end to it. So
Right.
definitely an interesting thing here. I could see the deck doing better if the deck has more time to be explored. But I just am waiting to see more from it.
Yeah, I don't really know that many people that are on that deck except for Cody as well. So the representation for the deck is very low as well.
So moving into a deck that we both know very well, and I feel like, you know, we've been either on opposite sides of this deck or we've been pretty much on top of it for Striker. I feel like this deck is really cool right now, especially because you just have such a good Despia matchup. And there's multiple ways you can play this deck. For me, I'd have to place this deck easily at like 1.5, but I want to hear what you have to say about it.
I think this deck is rogue right now.
You think
I
it's Rogue?
Yes, I think it's rogue because I think the Despia matchup is horrible for Striker.
Oh, I think
Honestly,
it's
all
great.
because of Brandon loss.
That's fair. Yeah, we're typically, like, when it comes to this deck, we're definitely on opposite sides sometimes. I feel like it has an amazing Despia matchup, to be honest. So that's why I put it higher. Um,
That's fair.
Interesting, though. I would say that we should just split the difference on that, though, and put it tier 2, then.
I could put it at tier 2, yeah. Tier 2 would be fine with me.
I think that, like, the deck itself, having things like Anchor and Cannon available to it to be able to shut off Brandon and Rudd and steal Mirror Jades, and then, like, if they get rid of their Mirror Jade, or if you force it off the board, they can just go, like, Dark and bring it back as well.
Right.
There's just so many different ways that you can play into the Despia matchup and just not care. Also, with the ways that you can play like, so many hand traps in the deck as well, I just feel like it's so decent, at least right now. But I could see where you put it a little lower.
Yeah, I would be fine with putting it at tier 2 right now. Mainly because I feel like I wouldn't play Striker over DDD right now, or like the 3-axis deck.
That's fair. When it comes to like IDS though, I feel like this deck is really good in unsolved formats. It's really nice just to be able to summon a window and call it a day sometimes. But once the format gets a lot more figured out, especially with there being another fusion deck just already hanging out and doing a bit better, I feel like this deck gets a little worse. Especially because everyone already knows like what this does and they're pretty much prepared for it, especially with their sideboard, because there's a lot of crossovers in the sideboard that we typically see that just kind of like dumpster this deck. Still very consistent though, still a very solid deck to play, but I just don't know if it's one of the better decks currently.
Right. So IDS right now, I'll be honest, I haven't respected this deck in a while.
Yeah.
And like the Despia matchup for it is horrible as well. So like the Prankin matchup's fine. The Flunder matchup is god awful, and so is the Eldritch matchup.
Yeah, it's kind of unfortunate, and we'll talk about the other variant of it later. I would honestly have to put this somewhere between 2 and Rogue, one or the other. I don't think that it really matters in this one. What would you say?
Yeah, I don't think it's Rogue per se, but I think tier 2, like it's on the line of tier 2 and Rogue.
Yeah.
For sure.
It's somewhere between the two. I'll throw it up in tier 2 for now, but definitely somewhere between the two. So there's a lot of decks right now that I feel like kind of ride that line between like 1.5 and 2, 2 and Rogue. One that I think is really interesting that not a lot of people are talking about right now, even just on like try DP list rather than just playing like try Brigade by itself. Because I feel like that's standard now to say is like try DP. The deck itself is really solid still, and I feel like not a lot of people are actually piloting it because they've just kind of swapped out for other decks, especially like the Despia deck. But I feel like there's still so many different ways that you can run this deck, and the fact that it's a non-targeting banish as well, just a really nice overall pick. And for me, I'd personally put it in like the 1.5 because I feel like it plays so much utility right now. Like, utility is the name of the game for me, and if you can do that in a deck, especially like this, I feel like you're already going to be ahead of the game.
Yeah, so before we start talking more about like the pure Tri Brigade, I kind of want to like move the Tri Brigade Brandish
Okay,
beside it and pretty much talk about the differences within the deck.
sure.
Because like pure Tri Brigade, they're still going to be playing Courier. But the other version, the other Tri Brigade version, is going to be playing like they're going to be playing like Branded Fusion to make Mirror Jade to search for Courier during the end phase and stuff like that. And the thing is like I feel like those are like very like important like changes to the deck.
They are.
Would you not say?
I think that's really cool because there is actually a pretty standard combo right now as well to be able to get to that Mirror Carrier and make a pretty decent end board. And then having the Mirror Jade on board is always a lot of pressure as well. It's a very nice addition to the deck. I think that does add another level to the deck for sure. I don't know if I still just prefer like the DP build though. I think that DP is still really nice, but having that Mirror Carrier definitely is nice.
Right. Because the only difference like in the two lists right now from like that's on the tier list that we see is going to be, are you playing DP or Branded Fusion?
Right.
And the thing is like I feel like they're just the same. They would go in the same category.
I personally had to put him at least 1.5. I think I respect this deck too much every time I play against it.
Really? Yeah, I can see them going into 1.5 all because of like Courier and the Branded Trap being put into the decks, both versions.
It's honestly going to
So
be one of those things that we're going to see a lot of soon, and I feel like a lot of people just haven't started respecting it, and it could be coming back really fast.
yeah, I feel the same way. Like the deck's also very underexplored right now as well.
Yeah, it kind of fell off once the bird cards got hit, but I feel like there is room for it to, like you said, be explored and come back pretty fast.
But yeah, I think 1.5 is like very fair for it though.
Yeah, I wouldn't put it any higher, but I think that it definitely has a good shot in the meta right now. The next one, though, I know that this has been in multiple variants, and there's also been like the Adventurer build, which I'm not really a fan of. I prefer just 39 good cards in Driver when it comes to the Dragon deck. The Dragon deck, though, I feel like it's in a really tough spot currently. I know that we've been talking a lot about Despia and its effects in the meta, but I feel like Dragon Link versus Despia is just a losing battle.
Yeah, it's really hard, especially like the thing is with like with Dragon as well. Like they've been integrating the Despia cards into their own deck as well with like the Branded Fusion, and also playing like Fallen Albaz and stuff in their deck to tag out into seals with. Um, but like you said, like the matchup is awful.
It is.
Like it's so bad, and like I don't even think it has like that great of a prank kid matchup as well, unless you draw a whole bunch of hand traps.
It does get really hard. I've seen this deck just kind of dwindle down a little bit on like what it was doing. And I don't know if this is the safest pick for the meta right now. I think that this is one of the very rare times that we see Dragon just not being it.
Yeah, exactly. And like there's only like what one or two that top the YCS and Charlotte, and with Despia like coming in to push it out even more, I feel like this deck is just tier 2 right now.
Yeah, I would have to agree. It definitely could maybe see more play down the line if we get more support or if we get new deck that also threatens like the Despia deck, right? But as of right now, it has a really hard time keeping up with the meta.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that.
As for our next one, though, we have Live Twin, and I feel like this is a deck that I'm just going to have to put into Rogue. I know that it plays a lot of utility, and there's a lot of people out there that really enjoy the deck, and it has the ability to Scythe Lock, and it has the ability to be able to at least play some cool cards like Enemy Controller and whatnot, to be able to dodge things like Imperm and steal from the opponent's board, but I just feel like the deck itself just does not have enough power to be able to break through a lot of the big boards that we're seeing currently, especially the Despia deck.
Yeah, I can see that for sure. Like, I feel like this deck is very similar to Adamantipator right now, where like they are scythe decks, but other decks scythe a lot better than they do.
Yeah, and we'll talk about those too. I just feel like the deck itself, it hasn't really gotten anything new lately, and it's kind of just been the same thing. And since it hasn't really been able to be explored, in my opinion, especially with the newer deck coming in that's a lot stronger, I just feel like it's just really weak at the moment.
Yeah, 100%.
As for our next one that we saw really pop off in the beginning of the format, and then now it's not really talked about. You might see one or two in Top Cut. It's the Phantom Knight deck. And I really want to hear what your thoughts are on this because, especially with a lot of the hand traps that we're seeing run in the format right now, I feel like this just has a really tough time. And then also the threat of things like Super Poly, and again, that Despia matchup, I feel like it just becomes even harder.
Right. So I feel like this goes to say, like, with all the scythe decks right now, since we are shifting from we are shifting from like nib in the main decks and like ogres into the main decks and getting them replaced with cards like DD Crow, Imperm, and Bell. I feel like this just inherently makes scythe decks a lot worse now, right? And so if I feel like if you play PK, you have to go back towards the Apollosa version of the deck where you only sap like DP Scythe Apo. And if you draw the Brave Engine, then that works as well. Because we're also seeing a lot more droplets in the main deck as well now. And with Super Poly also coming back into the main deck, like you said, I don't know. I feel like this deck it's just not it's not in a good place right now. So, like only because of like all these different types of like flex spot type cards coming back into the main decks and not the side decks.
Yeah, Phantom Knight is also like one of those decks that like still had like the bigger problem with bricking too. Like on top of that, so for me, I would just have to throw it down to like the tier 2 because again, it's just one of those decks like it can play the game and it can play the game pretty well, but like when it can't, it really can't.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that.
So now we're kind of getting into the decks that we really enjoy this format and things that we're thinking are a lot better than the previous ones here. Starting off with a pretty good one being Brave Tenyi. I think this deck immediately, in my head at least, goes to tier 1. I think this deck is really solid right now. It's a great choice. Cards like Vashuda versus Amir Jade, very strong. The Tenyi cards are honestly just broken. If you resolve Vessel, you should just be winning that game anyway. The ability to go Despot combo, and just all the new innovations we've been seeing to the deck, I feel like this is just easily a tier 1 deck.
So I'd have to like, I'd have to say that I don't really agree with that simply because it's doing what the base deck is doing and what the Sword Soul deck is doing, but worse. I feel like.
Do you feel like it's worse?
Yeah, I think it's worse than those decks only because like it doesn't really have that much of a grind game, and it still loses to any two hand traps, which is like a very big problem with the deck. And with people playing, like even though people are cutting hand traps from their main deck, they're still playing 9 to 12 in their main one, like in every deck right now.
That's fair.
And even if they're only playing 9 to 12, like going, I feel like if I were to go into an event and I was playing the Tingy Brave deck, I would just be terrified that knowing that I'm probably going to lose every time my opponent opens 2 hand traps. And also, before we start on with this list anymore, I feel like there should only be like 3 tier 1 decks in a format unless it's very special, like very very diverse format. Because if you think about it, whenever we start placing these other decks into like the tier 1 and tier 1.5, right?
Right.
There's going to be an obvious deck. Like if we put like 5 of these decks in tier 1, there's going to be an obvious deck that's just worse than the others. And by what we were going by earlier, that's just going to be immediately like it should be in 1.5 instead of tier 1.
That's fair. I could understand where you're coming from with that. I personally just really like the ability to play so many Tennies in the deck, and the fact that when you're just playing things like either pure Sword Soul, or if you are leaning toward like the sad deck, I just feel like the Tenny cards do give you just that bit better part of an edge, and I really enjoy that build instead. But I could see where you're coming from. We'll keep going with the list and talk about a couple of these other ones too.
Right. But as it is right now, I feel like the deck would be 1.5.
Yeah, I mean, I could definitely see that. As far as the other deck goes, though, if you want to just bring those two forward now and talk about them, because they're kind of similar, is going to be like the Sad deck and the Sword Soul deck. As far as Sad, what's your thoughts on that?
Sad, I feel like it's the better version of all the other like pile decks out right now. Because there's a lot of different things that make it like I, I would say like better than the other decks. Like for one, it has a lower deck count, and you're not playing all these bricks that the other decks are playing, so you're not having to play like Scythe in the deck, you're not having to play Despot in the deck, and just a whole bunch of these like other bricks in the deck. Also, like with Despia coming out, I feel like the deck still has like I don't think the Despia matchup is that bad for the Sad deck, where I feel like it's not great for the Teeny Brave deck as well. Also, I don't think it's that bad for Sword Soul either. But I feel like the ability of dumping, like having the utility in your extra deck to be able to send cards like Token Collector, Necrowall Bench, and Snow on your turn one and get pretty much getting to choose and adapt to whichever matchup you're playing goes a very, very long way, especially with how consistent the deck is as well.
See, I really like the fact that you can send things like that Token Collector, like you're saying, the turn one, because I feel like that card's just a blowout against many decks right now. And the Sad deck alone, it does have a lot of really nice utility spots in it, but I also do agree with you on the fact that having that lower deck count is always amazing to see. We've been seeing a lot of pile decks lately, and I've always said like a lot of these decks could be a lot better if there were 40 cards. And we've been seeing a lot of decks starting to drop down to a lower deck count, and I feel like that's been doing a lot of wonders for them. As far as the deck goes, though, where would you put it?
For Sad, I'd probably put it at tier one, just because of the matchups, like the more favorable matchups it has within the other decks that we have here on the list.
Yeah, I think that it's really nice, just because of the adaptability, like you were saying. It is just a really solid deck at the current moment. As far as like Sword Soul goes, though, just playing like off the pure variant versus we already talked about like the Brave Tenny versus the Sad deck. I think that Sword Soul is really solid right now, but I think as a deck by itself, I would put it not one, I would say at least 1.5. Because I still respect it more than the tier 2 decks right now, but I feel like it wouldn't be tier 1. Because like you're saying, if there's only 3 decks, and I'm already looking at 2 others that I think would be more in the spot at tier 1 right now.
Yeah, so I would have to agree it's tier 1.5, but I feel like it's a little bit better than all the other 1.5 decks that we have right now, if that makes sense.
That's right.
Only because like in the extra deck they have Long One, the Sovereign guy,
Yeah.
that pretty much just deals with the base engine on its own, like immediately. Also, like being able to make like have access to cards like Cheating, it has She-Shell, Blackout. So it's very versatile. Also, it doesn't lose to like the Eldritch deck Floodgates that hard. Because of cards like Vishuda in the deck, Blackout. So I feel like this is like one of the better 1.5 decks that we have right now.
Yeah, it's definitely nice. I think Sword Soul is one of those decks that a lot of people respect regardless of the format. Just because it's one of those things that A, has the potential to kill fairly quick, and B, it has really nice board breaking cards like Boxy even still. The ability to be able to play cards like Circle as well to dodge things like Imperm, since it's so prevalent in the format, is still very, very strong. I just feel like if we're talking about a couple tier 1 decks, there's a couple tier 1 decks that I would respect a little more than just Sword Soul. But we will again just talk about those as we get there, right?
Yeah, exactly. And another thing that I do like about Sword Soul as well is that it plays through hand traps very, very well.
That it does.
Like with the inclusion of Needle Fiber, I feel like the deck can play through 2 hand traps very, very easily. And another thing about the deck as well is that the it has a really really good Despia matchup,
Yeah.
like a really good Despia matchup. So I feel like just saying that, like I feel like it should be like in the higher 1.5 category, almost tier one.
Yeah, I moved it to the front. That's it's pretty good. Definitely ahead of the Tri Brigade deck, but I still like the Tri Brigade deck up there. I think that it's going to come back at some point in this format, personally. Especially with Mercury, I think that card's just neat.
Yeah, that card is a very very good addition to Tri Brigade for sure.
So when we start looking at like the Eldritch variants, specifically looking at the Trap variant, and then we had the Cyberus variant. While we're talking about the Trap variant, we can also talk about the Branded variant too. But where would you put the Trap versus the Cyberus?
So I feel like the Cyberse version is a little bit better than the Trap variant, only because it has a lot more power cards in the deck. Where like the Trap version, not saying it doesn't have power cards, but it's more susceptible to like an in-phase Guardian Chimera for two, or like it really has a very hard time with DPE. Where the Cyberse versions of the deck, like they end on Scythe, so it's a lot easier to like deal with those types of cards. Like if you can just Scythe in the standby phase. Um,
Yeah,
Also the fact that it has a lot more extenders in the deck as well, and a lot more like cards that make it more consistent. I feel like the Cyber Eldritch deck would definitely be above the Trap Eldritch version.
I think that the Cyberus deck is way better than the Trap build. Personally, for me, I do like the Trap variant in like 2, and I do the Cyberus variant in 1.5. I think that the Cyberus deck is the best way to Scythe lock, personally. I think this is the one that I would expect the most out of any of the Scythe variants, at least right now. But I think that the build alone, it just has a lot of playability in the format, and I feel like just the amount of extenders like we were talking about, it just doesn't lose to the same things that the actual just Trap variant does, and I respect it a bit more.
Right. Funny enough, I only because of the showing from the past YCS, I feel like the Cyber's Eldritch deck should be tier one. And I feel like the Trap Eldritch deck should be tier 1.5.
That's fair. You just shift them up one, yeah. I definitely had it at tier 1 in my own head. But I like shifted it down to the 1.5 because I just feel like even if we're looking at like the Despia deck, or if we're looking even at like the invoked branded or even prank kid, I just feel like those are other matchups too that just seem really nice right now, especially like I know prank kids are a little damaged by Despia being in the format right now, so people are viewing them as like lesser of the other decks currently, but I feel like they're still really, like you were saying earlier, like they can still put up a crazy board. So
Right.
to me, it's just one of those things where I was just kind of trying to move everything around in my own head and see where I would put that. But I could definitely see where you put them at like 1.5 for the trap build and like 1 for the service build. With that being said, though, and having like the other control type variants in the game currently, we'd also see Flow Unders, which is a deck that we just kind of see everywhere right now. And it's definitely been in and out of the top cuts. How do you feel like it's being damaged right now by Despia, especially with the sideboards?
So honestly, I feel like the fact that Despia came into the meta makes Flunder a lot worse now, because it pretty much plays what, like 12 zombie worlds in the deck now post side.
There's a lot
So
of ways to
like
get to it, yeah.
exactly, and like Flunder cannot beat that card. You have to side back row it like specifically for zombie world.
Yeah, that's tough.
And if you don't draw those cards, you just lose immediately if you're playing Flunder. And I don't really think that a tier one deck just loses to one card.
True. Definitely would. I mean, like, I still feel like you'd have to respect the deck though, in the format, because like, if you're playing against Despia and you go first and you're playing Flunder and you put up things like the statue, I feel like it's still kind of tough, right? Like at that point, it's still not going to be a favorable side of things. I mean, I would definitely still put Flunder in like 1.5. I think that
Yeah.
it's definitely hurt, but I don't think that it's by any means bad.
Right. I feel like Flunder was tier one like before Despia came out, but I feel like now that there's so many different ways to get to Zombie World and the representation of like Despia like growing, like I feel like there's no way I could ever put Flunder at tier one. But I feel like tier 1.5 would definitely suit it.
Yeah, it's definitely suitable. The deck itself, like I said, is still very scary. It's still very prevalent. A lot of people have it, and it's also very cheap now because they reprinted Ryza. Um, it's going to be everywhere, but again, with
Yeah.
Despia being in the format, it's very tough to justify it being at tier one.
Exactly. Now, if you don't play against a deck that's playing Zombie World, like that's what you want, right? Flunder is still going to do Flunder things, and like it's still going to like pretty much make like all these different interruptions and like put up all these different types of floodgates as well. Like if you're playing against something that's not playing Zombie World, and it will definitely have like favorable matchups against those types of decks.
So when we talk a lot about Despia, because we've been bringing that up the whole video, Despia this, Despia that, for good reason, right? Like the Despia deck is pretty crazy. It's a deck that can play through a lot. It can put up a lot. It's a really good deck. When it comes to Prank Kid, I feel like this is the one that a lot of people are going to be looking at and really trying to figure out where we're going to put this one because of the fact that it was such a powerhouse for so long. And then
Right.
now we're seeing the Despia deck, and everyone's like, is it still good? Are we still allowed to play it when this deck is running around? I feel like be all end all, the Despia deck is going to be there, and you have to realize that it's going to be there in the format. If you're going to play Prank Kid, you have to realize that you have the worst matchup versus that deck. And it's unfortunate, but if you are playing against literally anything else, you still have a pretty good time. I feel like your matchup's still pretty solid. Your first board is still really nice. But if you are against Despia, it is a rough go. Where would you put this?
So, like you said, like Despia is going to be the worst matchup for Prank Kid, and it will have good matchups across the board. Now, what I think Prank Kid players are going to do is adapt to that and play more cards in the main deck for the Despia matchup and sacrifice a little bit more of like uh sacrifice a little bit more cards for all these other matchups, right?
I think that's
Instead
true.
of instead of like playing ogre for like the brave cards, you may like want to swap the ogres out for bells just so you can improve your Despia matchup that much, or like
Crow.
add in DD Crow because that card is just very good against Despia right now. And I feel like the more the format goes along, the more adaptive the Prank Kid players will be towards the Despia matchup rather than like for instance like the sadder base decks that we see at tier one, or like even the Eldritch variants, Swartzel, all that. Right.
Right.
And whenever you start compensating more for the Despia matchup, I feel like it will be fine for Prank Kids. So I feel like the deck is still tier one for sure.
I was going to definitely hope that you were still up in the tier one category because a lot of people, especially when I go to a tournament, when I've been at regional, when I was just kind of out and talking to my friend groups, like a lot of people were like, Prank Kids is not really good. It's not really doing anything. But here's the thing. If you ever have a deck that has a lot of utility spots like Prank Kid, even if they are playing the Brave Engine, they're putting in 9 cards to play that, you still have so much room to be able to cater your main deck toward your worst matchup. Now, it may not always be favorable, but if you're going to an event and you're expecting to play against 4 or 5 of them, it's just a smart thing to do to be able to at least put in cards to be able to beat the matchup that you're already struggling against because your deck already wins against the other matchups that you know that you win against. So for that reason alone, I would also have to keep this in tier 1. The deck's still very much so alive and fine. The deck is still very oppressive with what it can put up, and I think this is still going to be a tier 1 deck for quite a while.
Right. And a lot of people also like the thing is like this past weekend, right, at YCS Bogota,
Okay.
like it was a Despia Prank Kid finals.
Right.
Like, and if the Prank Kids had that much of a bad matchup against Despia, they would not have been there at all. Even though, like, granted, Prank Kids did lose to Despia, like, in the finals, it doesn't mean that they didn't have a chance of winning.
Well, if you look at even the person who won, Chris, on his record sheet, he said that he played against 9 Despia mirrors. Imagine how many players that prank kid had to play against to get there, and how many Despia matches they had to play against, right? So, like, for that alone, you can just assume that maybe they played against 3 or 4, maybe 4 or 5 Despia players. And it still shows that the deck is very much so strong and can adapt to that format.
Right. Ruben did say that he played against 4 Despia players that weekend, but even though that may not seem a lot, like a lot, the fact it's the quality of players that he did play against, right? He played against CJ in the finals. He played against Patrick Hoban. He played against Hani, I believe. He played against Hani, and he played against someone else. He played Andreas as well. And
That's
like
crazy.
all these people that are piloting the Despia deck are just very good at the game on their own. And the fact that Ruben was able to like play prank kids against them and win, like that shows enough about prank kids, I believe, to definitely like solidate that it is tier 1 this format.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I think that it's still a very scary deck out there, and people are going to be realizing that very fast. Because I feel like a lot of people put the deck down, but it's definitely going to swing back around, and people are going to be back on it. The next one here that we have is Invoked Branded. Now, this deck is really cool. I think this deck has a lot of potential this format. I think that it definitely needs to be explored a little more on the ratios and what kind of cards you're playing with this, because I feel there's still some inconsistencies in the deck, but it is really nice to be able to go a normal Alistar and then have a Branded Fusion behind it. I'm definitely curious to know if you've played against this deck at all and what you think about it.
Funny enough, I actually played this deck for like 4 days whenever I was like exploring the different options for Despia, since for Despia there's like 7 different versions that you can play. Right. And I've been trying to play all of them and test the different strengths and weaknesses of all the different like builds of Despia and like versions. And I'll be honest, the Invoked version wasn't awful, but it was definitely not better than like the pure or like the brave Despia version.
Yep, I would have to agree with that. It's definitely interesting because I've played against it several times and I've tried it out myself. And the deck itself, it feels pretty clean, but at the same time, like you're saying, I'd rather just be playing Despia cards. Because at that point, you get to play so many better engines, like the Patchwork engine and whatnot, where I feel like you're just losing that when you play normal summon Alistar.
Right. I would definitely agree. So I will put this at 1.5, personally.
1.5. See, I could agree with that just solely because of branded cards being insane. But like also just the ability to be able to put up a negation and then still have hand traps is still very strong as well.
Exactly.
I feel like it does a lot more than other decks currently, so I mean, definitely gonna put it up there.
Yeah, it definitely does.
So Koty, this is the last one that we have here, being Despia branded. Definitely tier 1. There's very rarely an occasion when we see a deck that's like tier 0 crazy. But this is definitely tier 1. The deck itself, I feel like a lot of people saw it and then they were just like, oh, that deck doesn't really do a whole lot, and then they figured out that it does. Because I heard a lot of people doubting this deck before, when it was just kind of on its way out. And then people started really picking it up and started figuring out like which engines you should play. And I feel like the deck's really interesting right now because so many people are trying to like solve the deck and figure it out and like which engines you should and should not play. So it's tier 1 for sure, but I'm definitely curious to know where the deck's going to end up as like a standard build.
Right. I've been playing this deck for like a week and a half now, like pretty much just purely just playtesting with the deck. And I found that like I personally don't like the Brave cards in it. I like the more pure version of the deck more.
I would have to agree. I think that it gives you a lot more room to do what you like, and also having the follow-up with the Aluber normal summon. I feel like that's a lot more valuable to me when I'm playing this deck too, because you don't really need the Brave cards to be a means of negating like a hand trap. When you play the deck properly, you play it really correct, and you can play around those hand traps regardless. Being able to drop things in your grave so you can go ahead and Brandon Red dodge, having things like comedy for playing that. The deck, it just has so many ways that you can just play through and around hand traps that the Brave engine really isn't needed.
Right, I definitely agree with that. Like, I don't know which one is better, if it's Despia or Prank Kid right now, though. Or, like, honestly, any of these decks in the tier 1. Only because, like, Despia is so unexplored right now.
I think that deck's honestly insane. I thought that deck was aggressively mid, and then I played it a bit more, and I was like, wow, this deck's actually nuts.
Yeah.
But I think that in the grand scheme of things, I think Prank Kids ends up just being the best one. That deck,
Yeah,
like, is
it
just
may be.
crazy. You know, it
Yeah.
still does Prank Kid things. It has utility spots. If it adapts well to the format, it still beats all the other decks, and then it just, like, has an actual match that it needs to play when Despia comes up.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Like, even though Prank Kids don't do that well going second right now, and I feel like Despia definitely shines in that aspect of being able to go second. Um, I'm just not very sure which one is better. But what I do know is that these tier 1 decks right now, like, they're all on the same level, I feel like.
Yeah, and I know that someone's going to ask too about why this has base instead of sad. We just determined that this should just be sad. Not a lot of people are actually playing the base deck. It's more so just a sad deck. But it's definitely interesting to see where this goes. I think that the format definitely needs a bit more solving, especially if we're about to be getting a ban list rather soon or after the YCS. I think they're going to wait till after, but I could be wrong.
It's gonna be like a week after, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, that's what I'm betting on right now. But I definitely would say that they are all pretty equal, but for me, at least Prank Kids gets my vote for today.
That's fair. Like, honestly, I feel like Despia is a little bit better into these matchups only because of the fact that you're able to go second a lot better
That's fair.
than Prank Kids. Which, even though, like, Prank Kids plays all these hand traps, like, Despia plays, like, more blowout cards. Like, they play triple tactics, they play Forbidden Droplets in their main deck, they play Super Poly in their main deck, and, like, I don't know. I just feel like the engine itself is just more geared to go second. Which is why I feel like I would put it above Prank Kids right now.
Especially getting that additional draw going second's nuts.
Exactly.
It means so much. So that's definitely cool. But you know, I always appreciate you coming out to these videos and helping me just kind of break down the meta for everyone, because I feel like this is an important conversation to have, especially when there's so many different decks out there to play. And a bigger deck just came in the format, and everyone's just like, well, where does my deck stand now? I feel like this is definitely a nice conversation to be had.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I always like doing these types of tier lists as well, getting to explain different different thoughts, pretty much different opinions, and being able to go back and forth with people is always very nice.
Yeah, Devil's Advocate's always good for Yu-Gi-Oh! That I feel like not a lot of people get to play enough.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, any final thoughts?
I personally think this format's pretty good right now. It's pretty fun. There's a lot of diversity within the format, a lot of room for innovation as well. And yeah, I can't wait for YCS Hartford, honestly.
Yeah, I'm really excited. I got a regional this Sunday too. I personally really enjoyed this format myself. I feel like there's a lot of people out there who just really don't, but I don't know. I just kind of take Yu-Gi-Oh for what it is, and if it's not a hand looping format, I'm enjoying myself.
Right.
I can't stand hand loops, man.
Yeah, I'm not really that big of a fan of FTKs either.
Yeah. So I mean, as long as it's playable, I'm playing. That's all I'm saying. But again, thank you so much for joining us here, and I hope that everyone has a wonderful night.